All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome on behalf of the Washington Office on Latin America, WOLA, to the discussion on the documentary Borderland, The Line Within. And I want to thank you all for joining us and thank the panelists, especially for both their work on the film and for joining us today. I'm Maureen Meyer, WOLA's Vice President for Programs. I hope you've all had a chance to watch the film. If not, the viewing link is available to the end of the day, and I know there'll be other screenings throughout the next few months, so maybe Pamela and Paco can also fill us in on those details. Borderland comes at a moment when migration is one of the top priorities, top issues being discussed in the lead up to the US elections in November. And more importantly, at a time of historic migration flows throughout the region and worldwide, and where I think we've unfortunately seen increasing efforts by the US and other governments focus much more on deterrence and limiting migration and access to protection than really a focus on how do we expand legal pathways and respect the rights of migrants and asylum seekers at the border and beyond. I think the film itself provides an important look at the many facets of migration, from the profits made by US corporations in detaining and locking up thousands of migrants and asylum seekers, the plight of people coming to the United States in search of asylum, family separation that is a result of US deportation policies, and the efforts, and this is really important, by many people to organize, resist, and envision a more welcoming and inclusive approach to US immigration policy. So to get the conversation started with our panelists, I want to introduce you to my colleague, Adam Isaacson, who leads our work on border security and migration, and just had the opportunity actually to spend a few weeks at the border, including in El Paso. So Adam, I will pass it off to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Maureen, and thank you to Pamela, Paco, and Fernando for being here today. So you've all seen, or maybe you still will today, but you've seen this excellent film, Borderland, it's a real achievement, and I have a lot of things to ask about it, but I will try to limit myself so that we do have time for the last 15, 20 minutes or so for you all to ask a question too. I'm told that the best way to do that is either in writing by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, or to raise your hand, and we will try to get the video and audio working correctly so that you can actually ask a question directly if you prefer. I'm going to just introduce our panelists here. We have the two filmmakers and one of the stars of the documentary. Pamela Yates is an award-winning film director, the director of Borderland. She is the co-founder of Skylight, the nonprofit media organization that's been around, I think, since the 1980s. Directed and produced many films, many of them award-winning. I remember seeing When the Mountains Tremble when I was in college, and it really, I think it played a role in keeping me really interested in this work, which I still continue to do. There's too many to name right now. I could just spend the whole time introducing everybody. Paco de Onis is the producer of Borderland and the executive director, executive producer of Skylight. He has many producing credits, both on his own and with Pamela over the years, many of these films, and I look forward to hearing from him as well. And Fernando Garcia is the executive director and the founder of the Border Network for Human Rights, based in El Paso. The Border Network goes back to the early 1990s. I believe Fernando joined in the early 2000s in his current position. And Fernando is just an incredible organizer and activist in the El Paso area, but increasingly up and down the border. It really is, and where there are so many challenges to meet. But he's worked with the community in El Paso, training, often really doing good at training people to train others, creating corps of human rights promoters who teach their neighbors about what their rights are and how to defend them, and how to spread that. Since the early 2000s, they've also done a remarkable job of documenting abuses committed by U.S. border authorities, but also local border authorities. And they've become a key source of information for those of us in Washington trying, with some mild success, to improve accountability over border law enforcement. So Fernando, it's really great to have you here as well. And if you saw the film, you've seen quite a bit of Fernando. So I'm going to just jump in and maybe launch a question really for the filmmakers first. Maybe I'll go to Pamela first, but one thing that we struggle with here, when you're just talking about the border and migration, there are so many facets to this story. I mean, we could be talking about detention one day, migrant deaths in the desert the next day, asylum access the next day, fentanyl the next day, the border wall the next day. It gets to be a bit too confusing sometimes for our audiences. And Borderland does take on a lot of these many facets of the issue, like really head on. You're doing it often through profile. You're accompanying people. You're doing it through their experience and having them tell the story as they're struggling with these. And these are people, but because it's so bifurcated, might not even ever be in the same meetings together, even though they probably should once in a while. I guess just as an initial question, I mean, the storytelling aspect of this, Pamela, was it a challenge to take all these different aspects and perspectives and make them into a coherent narrative, or you just kind of found that it just kind of hung together naturally or organically? I mean, as you try to tell the story.
We try to make it as an invisible hand, but it actually was a 5-year effort that covered the entire United States, and speaking with many people who we spoke to aren't in the film, but speaking to them informed how we actually tell the story. And then of course, there's a filmmaking aspect. Filmmaking, cinema is a language in and of itself. So how do we take the language of what's going on politically, socially, and culturally at the border and turn it into a cinematic art form? And we first started to make this film when the inhumane immigration policies on the part of the Trump administration were so egregious on the one hand. And on the other hand, the people who were finding ways to confront, to resist, to change that policy were so creative, including, of course, the Border Network of Human Rights, which was one of the first organizations, and Fernando was one of the first people that we met, helped shape the story and the direction. And the other thing is we needed to look at all of the other films and works and books that were out there about immigration. So how could we actually contribute our granito de arena, our tiny grain of sand, to this body of work, including the work that Wola does? And one of the ways that we decided to do that was to follow the money, because following the money reveals so much about what is actually behind the border policy and why these cruel and inhumane policies continue to make profits from the suffering of human beings. And that was how we shaped the story. And that's really, with the XP method, the academic digital humanists that reveal what is behind the border industrial complex, thread it all together. So it really was following the money, because it's the money, it's the taxpayers' money, it's our money. Every single person has a say, should have a voice, should have a vote in how we spend the taxpayers' money. And that's what we leave you with at the end of the film. The border industrial complex in 2024 is $25 billion of our tax money. And what are we going to do to change these policies?
So, I mean, just turn it over to Paco, sort of following the money theme. What you do see in the film is this border industrial complex, which is quite wealthy, which is, it's quite monolithic. It is often bipartisan. At some moments in the film, you're like, this is just too huge. How do we take this on? But on the other hand, you're showing groups like the Border Network for Human Rights, you're showing Milpa, you're showing No More Deaths, you're showing these folks who are mapping the detention centers. There does seem to be a lot of organizing going on, and it provides hope. So, I mean, what is that the main takeaway that a viewer should have, that this is a huge phenomenon, a giant problem that we all confront, but there is hope, and hope lies with these grassroots groups? Or would you put it some other way?
No, I think you're putting it really quite well. One of the big reactions, or perhaps the biggest reaction we've seen at the screenings that we've done so far, is this expose, this revelation of the border industrial complex. For people who have actually been concerned about immigration and thought about it and have done things about it. They've donated money to organizations that work on immigration rights, and yet they had no idea the extent of it. And I think that when people see that map with detention centers literally in every corner of the country, it's really a shock. So the visualizations that the academics of the XP method did are really powerful. And what's also really powerful is to see immigrants organizing themselves for their rights. And that's a story that you don't really often see in films about immigration, but I think it's just crucial, it's key. And that's what's going to chip away at the border industrial complex. These budgets and these policies that get enshrined in something like the border industrial complex. So it reminds me of the war on drugs. Once it's there and the money's flowing to every congressional district, it's really hard to bring those things back. But it's a long struggle.
It is it's a long struggle, but you do point to some ways through. Before I want to ask Fernando some questions about this, getting through to people and explaining this complexity to people. But first, I should just ask before we move on. I mean, Pamela and Paco, what moved you to take on the border? Was it just the news of what the Trump administration was doing? Because in the beginning, you do have these text messages or audio messages from Kash, who was in your earlier film. Did he sort of lead you into this as well?
No, it was really Kash came along about a year into the making of the film.
Oh, okay.
Kash decided to flee Guatemala about a year into the making of the film. No, what really moved us was during our research trip that we traveled all over the country, and we met Fernando, and we met Gabriela Castañeda, and we met the people at the Border Network for Human Rights. And rather than making a kind of a survey film about different people's reaction to this inhumane treatment, it really was the most powerful idea was at the Border Network for Human Rights, how immigrants and immigrant families are building leadership, building strength in their communities, and becoming leaders themselves. And that became the driving force of the film. It was only a year later when Kash Mural WhatsApped me and said he was leaving Guatemala, and I asked him to document his journey, that he really became part of that, because he's part of this whole idea that we never get to hear about, which is that immigrants have agency, immigrant families have agency, and they know how to use the agency, and they're spreading the word. And there is this movement building in the shadow of the border industrial complex. And like in all our films, even in the darkest moment, there are always people finding a way forward. So we are really featuring in Borderland the people who are finding that way forward. And they're doing so with a lot of strength, a lot of creativity, a lot of knowledge. And they're embracing other people and calling them in. Just like we're documentary filmmakers, whenever, and the Border Network for Human Rights does documentation of abuses, whenever you feel impotent to change anything, it's still really important to document, because documentation can be used now, yesterday, and in the future for all kinds of things that are going to be incredibly important, including telling our own story, creating our own historical record.
That's a great point. Sometimes, documenting can be very depressing when you don't see the short-term possibility of change. However, having worked on Colombia, for instance, a lot of colleagues in Colombia were doing this work during the darkest days of the conflict, that then became the core of the work of the Peace Accord, or rather the Truth Commission in the future, and has been essential for getting accountability once it was possible to do so. So that's true. Fernando, I'd like to talk to you a bit about, well, all of this. I mean, how the Border Network, and I should actually just thank you. I was just at your offices about a week and a half ago, and I met with Al and Samantha, who are doing such great work. But you're up against this big border industrial complex, up against, or actually they're also mixed in. They're part of your community, right? I mean, everybody's going to, school with the kids at Border Patrol agents. You see the community, you see the border industrial complex almost everywhere you go in El Paso. At the same time, it's not just the border industrial complex. We saw the Republican National Convention last week with hundreds of people waving signs that said mass deportation now. So it's a set of attitudes as well. And you're at the border, you're trying to defend people's rights. How do you approach both of those elements, the people who hold those beliefs, but also the people whose paycheck depends on it in your everyday work?
Yes, first I want to thank you, Adam, for the invitation, and of course, Pamela and Paco that actually spent it a lot of time in El Paso, many trips to work in this film. But before I answer that question, I would like to actually make a point in terms of what the importance and relevance of this film. And because I do believe that what we are being confronting, really, I mean, besides the material infrastructure at the border that we'll talk about it is something that is less tangible, which is the distortion and the distorted narrative about what is being happening at the border and what is being happening with the immigration phenomenon, to a point that distortion had been lifted as a main political agenda in the United States, and in not only is part of a political agenda, but also is being transformed into actual policies and strategies. So out of a narrative that is distorted, then you have distorted policies and strategies at the border. And when I talk about the distortion, I talk about how migrants are being painted in this political discourse. I mean, how the discourse of the invasion, right? The invasion of criminals. This idea that immigrants represent national security threat, for example, or the distortion of what is happening at the border, that El Paso, for example, is being painted as a city that is in the middle of violence and chaos and mayhem. All of that is false. I mean, and what is important to say is that the vast majority of that narrative that is being presented by the extremists, politicians, and nativists, it is being distorted. So in this film, hopefully, will help to actually strengthen the record about several things. First, about the root causes of migration, why people is leaving. I mean, what is happening in Central America and in Mexico also? The violence, the economic displacement, what is really happening, why people is really coming, right? The second thing that this documentary does is talking about the 40+ year of intense militarization at the border. And when I say that, it is backed by numbers, right? $20 billion a year being spent at the border, making it one of the most militarized borders in the world, probably the third or the fourth. And however, we're not at war with Mexico. So in the impacts of that militarization, not only impacting migrants coming across that are dying in higher numbers than ever, but also border residents, U.S. citizens that live at the U.S.-Mexico border that are being treated differently from the rest of the nation. And also, I think the film is crashing to this idea that border policy is infused by racism, white supremacy, and xenophobia. So that is the main motive that is the main framework of our border policy, almost regardless of parties and administration. I mean, both Democratic administrations and Republicans have been equally bad in terms of really pushing this militaristic approach. And along with that, the criminalization of children and women and families and border residents. So I think that is being portrayed in the film. But I think what I also get most the value of this film is how we living at the border, communities that are resisting and organizing, are not seen as a victim, but agents of change. And I think that is what is a major lesson. I think that we need to discuss out of the film, but also out of what is happening at the border. I think more and more border communities are realizing that nobody's going to come to save them enough, if not themselves. So immigrants, at the end of the day, nobody's going to give them rights if they don't fight for them. So I think that is all of those is encompassed within what this film is projecting, but also what is representing in terms of fighting that narrative.
Thank you, Fernando.
I don't know if you all would care to add anything to that very important point. But one challenge that we do face when trying to dispel the myths on which, or even the vibes on which a lot of these policies are founded, is that I think often our message is too complex. That we're reduced to fact checking and responding and showing statistics and trying to communicate what a better vision of the border is, but the other side can just say build the wall, open borders, a lot of epithets like that, and sometimes it feels like we get drowned out. Now, clearly, as Pamela said, the cinematic art form is a great way to try to tell this story. Do you hope that for somebody who may be considering waving a sign that says mass deportation now, that there is a way to get through to those folks? Or is it more? Is your audience just more people who are more persuadable? I mean, I think you know what you mean. I mean, we do have a big challenge here reaching larger public opinion. And what are some ways, both in your work, Fernando, in El Paso, and Pamela and Paco, your work, with cinema, what are some ways that you've found the biggest, say, the most effectiveness, the biggest bang for the buck in making people to see what's happening? One thing that comes to mind for me, of course, was during the family separation debacle of 2018, actually getting some video and audio of what was happening so that people really had to confront it. But you can't do that every time. Any thoughts on just that reaching larger public opinion, especially at a time when the window has sort of shifted in the other direction? Anybody?
Yeah, I'm still sort of sitting with the weight of what Fernando said.
Yeah.
But I wanted to say that one of the ways that we have really something big to offer is that we focus on the beauty of people's humanity in the stories, in the films that we tell. And, who they are, what are their hopes and aspirations? How are they carrying them out? How do they treat their neighbors? How do they envision the world that they want to live in, the world that we want to live in?
Mm-hmm.
I think you'll notice in all of our films that I focus a lot on close-ups, on the human face, because I believe that the geography of the human face is one of the most beautiful panoramas in cinema. So how do we use beauty to actually underline the horror and the difficulty? And I think that the juxtaposition of those two things, those emotions, can make for very powerful, persuadable messages. I think it depends on the audience. It's very important, actually. We undermine ourselves sometimes when we say things like, oh, well, we're just preaching to the choir. No, what we're doing is we're strengthening the movement. And we all need encouragement. Every single person needs encouragement to keep going, because this is a hard fight. So we're strengthening the movement. We're recharging people's batteries. For persuadable people, I think we're really touching their emotions. What the people at the Border Network for Human Rights have built, and the amount of time it's taken them to build it. And Fernando even says in the film, the hardest thing that you're going to do is change the consciousness of a person. And yet they persist. I think that is a really powerful, persuadable effort. The people who don't agree with us, I always feel, if you know your neighbor, if you actually get to know the person who's been pointed out to you as the other, you're going to feel really differently about it. And as people, as human beings, we can only meet a certain number of people in our lives. We can only touch a certain number of people in our lives. But cinema can touch millions of people. Mm-hmm. And so we want cinema to go out, and we want to feature and highlight and uplift the stories of the people that are there. And, when we go to screenings and show the film, a lot of other people get up, stand up, and tell their stories. For us, some of the greatest screenings are where people don't agree with us or don't agree with the ideas in the film. And we defend them, and the people in the audience defend them, and a real dialogue gets going. But we also never forget to strengthen where our real strength is, which is the movement and the people most affected by these policies. So in that sense, too, at Skylight, we have a policy of doing everything in Spanish as well as English. So we now have a Spanish version of the film. And we're soon going to have a bilingual version of the film so that Spanish-speaking and English-speaking audiences can watch it together and discuss, debate, and come up with active solutions or come up with actions.
Right. And I think persuadable is a key word there, because there, there's that persuadable place, and emotions help persuade people. I think, when you see the humanity people in the film, and the film can really bring that across, and people have the basic values that we all have: a love of family, the need to support yourself and your family, having fun, playing soccer, it's just basic stuff. It's just human stuff. And then folks like that are getting abused and dehumanized with, the language of what I call the war on immigrants. And the film, I hope, can help counter that. We, in order to make this film as available as possible and bypass any kind of restricted distribution, we have put a form on our website where people can request to host a screening in their homes. And we've gotten many requests. We've actually put an app on our website that shows people from, northern Montana to the middle of Maine, Kentucky, you name it, all over the country. These screenings are going to be happening in people's homes and churches and community centers. So, that's another way to just get the dialogues going about immigration with a human basis.
Well, congratulations for that.
And I wanted to add a couple of things. The first one, well, is that I do believe that I strongly believe that there are three paths or three different strategies to achieve the change that we want in the future. The first one, I think, is portrayed in the documentary. I think we deeply believe in community organizing and leadership development. And what that means is that the best way to present story is to allow the impacted communities to tell the story. Many times that doesn't happen. And so I think the more that we speak, and when I say the more that we speak is refugees, asylum seekers, dreamers, border residents, the more we tell the stories, I think that also will galvanize the next strategy that I'm thinking about, which is building a new or better community-oriented narrative. Because I think if we don't have a successful narrative, the other side is going to continue using fear, emotions in a very dark way to present their vision of America. So I think we need to actually reclaim ourselves the work, not only working within our communities and allies, but also working to shape a vision of what we are and what we want. And I think there are three elements in this building a new narrative process, which is one is the humanity, which is we totally agree with that. I think that's why we are launching Hugs Not Walls every year or every time that we can, because we need to show that what the impacts of this policy, of these strategies are destroying families, and many of them American families in that sense. The second thing is about human rights. So I think we talk a lot about civil rights, but I think human rights continue to be something that it seems that is very powerful in terms of promoting the basic idea that human beings are equal in dignity and rights. And I think if we continue talking about it, I think we continue expanding that idea that regardless of immigration status, regardless of where you come from, you still have rights and dignity. And finally, it has to do with what I still want to rescue, which is the best of the American values, because there are some American values that are that we can actually use. I mean, not everything that happened in America was bad. I think this idea that this country is exceptional because of immigrants and immigration, we can still use that and say we built this country. Immigrants built this country, whether you came through Ellis Island or through the new Ellis Island, which is this border. At the end of the day, that's what makes America exceptional. So we continue talking along those terms, on those lines. I think we can achieve that idea of changing minds. But ultimately, I also believe that besides that narrative, that education and organizing, I think we're committed to build a social movement that is going to change America. So I think at the end of the day, it will happen. I strongly believe that the conditions are where two Americas are in place, or maybe three of them. But I think one of them is very obvious. I mean, an America that built walls, detention centers, put children in cages, denigrate minorities, wants to get back to the 40s and even way before in the last century where nobody had rights, to another America that actually understand that we're very diverse, multicolor, and beautiful, and that's the only way moving forward. So I think that is what is being at the heart of the discussions nationally. But I believe that the communities getting organized and connecting minorities and people of color, we're going to achieve that strong movement that is going to change this country, and it's going to change what this country is going to be for the next 100 years.
So the three strategies: organizing and leadership development, letting communities tell their story, building a community-oriented narrative, a vision based on humanity, human rights, and the best of American values, and then building a larger social movement. One thing this reminded me of is the word. A few of you now, I think maybe all of you, have used the word humanity, and that we have to rescue people's humanity. What about the people who work in the border industrial complex, the agents, the officers, even just the contractors? Most of them aren't monsters. Most of them are actually members of your own communities if you live in the border. But maybe I ask you to reflect on what this border complex does to the people who work for it. There's a scene where Gabriela talks about how, the agents in the ICE, when she checks in with ICE, there are people who have just completely hardened themselves off to having someone in front of them crying about being separated about their families, or mother about to be separated from their kids, or how, you certainly talk to people who've been through ICE detention. You have this FOIA footage of the raid on Bird Camp in 2020 in Arizona. You see people carrying out very harsh tactics without seeming like they're feeling anything. On the other hand, in Gabriela's case, the officer does take pity on her at the last minute and decides not to send her away. So just any reflections, especially, Fernando, you BNHR has spent years cultivating at least dialogue, if not relationships, with the El Paso sector of Border Patrol. This is very important to me because I've done a lot of work documenting abuses, and it gets pretty depressing, just the whole scale of what is going on. But what does this complex do to the humanity of people who work for it? And does that change at all depending on who's in charge of the government, be it the state or the federal government at the time? Any of you who want to take that?
Oh, I can jump. It's interesting. Just this afternoon, I was having lunch with some of our volunteers and staff. And one of our volunteers, young volunteer college student, she told me that she wanted to be a border patrol. I mean, and she's working with Border Network for Human Rights. She's a volunteer of Border Network. And she's part of one of the families that are being working with Border Network for the last 20 years, I guess. So this is the fact. I mean, that many in Border Patrol belong to the communities that we live with. I mean, they are not strangers from our community. Many family members and relatives are part of Border Patrol. So it is important to say that even though there's like individuals and like some bad apples, right, with Border Patrol per se, we don't believe that the problem is with the individuals necessarily. It's with the systems that have been put in place by administration after administration, Congress after Congress. And one thing that they had not done, I mean, what they've been very successful about launching this war against immigrants at the border, and putting Border Patrol as the front line in putting in their heads and in their minds that at the border there's a war and there's an enemy, and if you go out there as a Border Patrol agent, then you need to be afraid, but also you need to be forceful and shoot and kill and beat people. I mean, there's a whole narrative that is being developed within the ranks of Border Patrol and as a part of the policy as such, right? Interestingly, because I want to give that the latest data on fentanyl, which 99.5% of fentanyl that comes through the border comes through ports of entry in legal ways and trucks and boats and planes, not between ports of entry where supposedly there's this war against drugs, right? So so then they beef up with this mentality of war. So they go out there, Border Patrol, and they easily can discharge a weapon or just do that, right? But Border Patrol systems and Congress administration, they are not being that successful in creating the oversight and accountability mechanisms for Border Patrol. I mean, there's not a single mechanism that would check about what are the level of abuse happening in Border Patrol, or what are the level of incidents of use of lethal force, or the systemic violation of civil and human rights at the border. So I think that is the main concern, that there is no systems in place, and that goes against what we call American values, which is check and balances, right? I mean, you implement a policy, you need to have something. So there is a complete disregard of these check and balances at the border. And I think that is one of the problems, that there's no oversight on the billions of dollars and the manpower and the weapons that Border Patrol uses. So I think rather than just blame an individual agent, I think we need to look for systemic change, right? I mean, we need to reform enforcement. We need to do it differently. We're not calling to disappear Border Patrol or the police. We're saying that at the end of the day, I think their goal and the objective should be different. They need to be trained differently, and a different policy and a different accountability mechanism should be in place, because we do have engagement with Border Patrol very constantly in El Paso. In that community engagement that has lasted 20 years, had created concrete changes already. I mean, El Paso region is where there's less incidents of abuse are happening, as the opposite in other regions, right? Because this community engagement and dialogue, and if you want to call it community accountability process, is happening when there's an organized community, but not that organized community is not everywhere along the border. We're trying to do that, but we're not there yet.
Yeah, I would say that following what Fernando just said, what you're saying, Fernando, really impressed me when we were making the film. The way that Border Network engages with the Border Patrol, and what you're describing is really where it's kind of, you're reminding the Border Patrol agents that are from those communities that the people in those communities are humans like them, their friends, their colleagues, their cousins, right? And that's so important, because a friend of mine who is in Norway just recently told me that he was there. People were talking about immigration and how in Norway they spend a lot of money, but resettling people, guiding them in, finding work for them. You know, it's just it's a humane process of welcoming immigrants that they need. They need the workers, but they find a way to channel them into the country, into the society, rather than wage war on the immigrants, which are needed. Like when Trump talks about deporting 12 million immigrants, I think, wow, really? If he did that, then what? What would happen to this country? If you think about it in any sort of rational way, right? It's just this crazy hate mongering. It's so damaging.
When we make documentary films, we do a huge amount of research. We try to know about every film that's out there, but also we read a lot. And one of the books that I read very early on, The Line Becomes a River by Francisco Cantu. He's first generation Mexican American who joined the Border Patrol. And then the book is about his transformation over 2 years. And I found it to be incredibly poignant and instructive. Francisco is also a poet, so he's a beautiful writer. He writes from the heart. But you really get the feeling of what happens when you're part of this complex, how you're a cog in the wheel, and what you're forced to do and how you're forced to act in a way that he could no longer justify it morally, and he quit. But it's these systems and the possibility of having a middle-class life and all of the things that come along with an industrial complex that have to change. And it really has to come, that kind of change really does have to come from the bottom up. And that's why the work being done on the border is so important, and the accountability and the documentation of abuses is one of the things that's going to staunch that tide.
We've talked a lot about documentation and citizens doing oversight. And, that's not necessarily the change that gets a lot of advocates or even, philanthropists very excited all the time, but it's clearly, it's the first step. And, Francisco and BNHR have shown, what happens when you engage on that for a long time. You do start to bring out some of the humanity in the people that are in your community. Which leads to another issue that doesn't quite appear in the film, but it's hard to ignore when you're talking to somebody from the Texas border right now. Paco already was just talking about sort of hatred and deep-seated feelings of racism, and it feels like engaging with the state government of Texas right now, which is going after migrant shelters, which has troops actually firing lethal and non-lethal weapons on people right at the borderline, that has concertina wire, that is putting people in prisons, that I could go on. Operation Lone Star, I know, has been occupying the Border Network for Human Rights very much in the last couple of years, and it was just sort of getting underway, I think, when most of your filming happened. But Fernando, would you care to comment on the state of Texas and how perhaps your strategy has to differ in this case, or maybe it doesn't?
No, and actually it has changed much of our, I would say, policy strategy, if you want to say it like that, because not necessarily the organizing strategy, because what it changed is that we're now, because of Operation Lone Star, because this anti-immigrant agenda in Texas, we've been able to expand ourselves from El Paso now into Presidio, Eagle Pass, Del Rio. So Border has human rights centers along the Texas border, which we didn't have that 4 years ago, which I think is a major development. But what is happening in Texas, it is not necessarily new, but it's the new level of states, especially state politicians, using this distorted narrative of the invasion of criminals, and we talk about that, to justify, to try to make the case why states, they need to do immigration enforcement and border enforcement, which we know that is being always the responsibility of the federal government, with all of the flaws that the federal government has, no? But in this case, what we're seeing is the states violating the law and the Constitution, like is happening in the state of Texas, is deploying 10,000 National Guard troops between El Paso and Brownsville, putting barbed wire along the river in federal land, using the DPS, the state troopers, to actually go after immigrants and within border communities. So we're in a state of siege at the border, not only because of the federal militaristic enforcement that we have, but also because the new level of state enforcement enforcing federal immigration laws. So I think that's creating another layer of problems. And I think what is being revealing is that the federal government has done almost nothing to actually push back on the state of Texas to reclaim the federal authority on immigration enforcement. So that is a political decision. Mr. Greg Abbott is doing a political decision, thinking that taking on the border from a state perspective is going to get them national points for going after elected positions. But I think what it shows, though, is how the issues of the border, the issue of immigrants, even in that distorted way, some politicians are seeing it as a plus for the political careers. So, but however, this, beyond just to be a political stand, is also actually causing harm at the border already. So more migrants are dying in Texas crossing the border now than before. Actually, it tripled the number of migrants dying because many of them had been entangled in the river in those barbed wire racers that they have there. Some of them actually being shot by National Guard troops that should not engage with immigrants and refugees. And the amount of accidents caused by DPS in El Paso, in Del Rio, in the Texas Valley had actually increased dramatically, causing a lot of damage within our community. So we are, in reality, we are in a double, triple whammy in that sense that we are responding not only to the federal enforcement policy, but also to Operation Lone Star and Operation in SB4, which is the attempt for the state of Texas to enforce immigration law. So we are expanding the organizing model. We're training more human rights promoters in all of these communities along the border, thinking that that's a way that we're going to create the mechanisms and the community structures to resist this new kind of violent attack. Finally, I want to say that this is only going to get worse, especially depending on the results of 2025. You know, if the results end up in implementing Project 2025 in 2025, then we're going to see the state of Texas being the example of the national policy towards the border. That means that we're going to have other states forcing their own immigration laws and start having their own immigration policy.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for that, Fernando. Here well, this just as a parenthetical at WOLA, we're extremely alarmed and voicing this alarm that Texas forces are using use of force standards that we really haven't seen law enforcement use, at least as a matter of policy in the United States in a long time. And it's a very unprecedented, at least in the modern era, use of U.S. military force as well. So we're on top of this as well. Very concerned. So I had a long-winded question about the election, et cetera, and I'll ask that if there's time. But we now have three questions in the Q&A. The first, why don't I read at least two of them and see if and then you all can respond. The first is, when you started the initial research for this documentary, Pamela and Paca, you're traveling across the U.S., meeting with different organizations and people. How much of a set idea did you already have for what the documentary would be about? I guess, were you sort of adjusting along the way, or did it really sit in early? One question, I guess, is for me, what are like WOLA's strategies, and I guess BNHR's strategies as well, for reaching Kamala Harris or other candidates with different approach to the border? And is there some way you can get she or people close to her or her staff or other candidates to actually see the film? How do you promote dialogue at screenings when you're screening in front of some of an audience or people who disagree? And what resources would you recommend to people for promoting this dialogue in such situations? In my case, the questioner says, as a community college professor. Why don't I stop there? I think you can see the Q&A as well, so I don't have to summarize that. But any thoughts on those initial questions?
The way that we make documentaries is a process, but we always start out with an idea. The idea over the years broadens and deepens, but the idea for this film was that after having made a trilogy of films in Guatemala over 35 years, in 2016, we really needed to make a film in the United States, because I believe that if you work internationally, you must have a critique of your own country, and you must be able to work politically in your own country. And so I thought that as a way to bridge our work in Latin America with being Americans and being actors in this country, we should look at immigration. That was really it. But then how you tell that story and who tells the story, and how you take both personal stories and interweave them and have a meta story, which is following the money all together, is one of the things that takes a long time. We make films with real people. We don't control anyone. We don't have actors. We don't tell people what to do or what to say. The beauty is in what they do and what they say. And we're documenting it. We're making cinema with it. But really, that is the sort of the raw beauty of documentary filmmaking. It's a journey of discovery. And if you have a fixed idea when you go in, then you're going to lose that kind of beauty. If you have a fixed idea when you go in, that's a news report. That's a Frontline. That's a 60 Minutes. But we make these films and we make them to be evergreen. So even though we're capturing a certain moment in time, we want the ideas to be big ideas. And we want the ideas to be these big ideas that people and organizers can go out with and take and discuss over many years.
Yes. Yeah, one of the questions is about, how do you deal with people who don't agree? Well, I think you talk. One of the great things about a documentary, that especially when people see it in the same space, like a cinema or a community center or wherever that space may be, is that it creates a space afterwards for dialogue. And we personally feel like there's really almost no point in showing a documentary if there isn't a space to talk afterwards. I mean, there is a point, of course, but it's so much better when people can talk and listen, right? And if somebody has a different point of view, when we premiered Borderland in May in New York City, there's a lot of confusion amongst people who they're not anti-immigrant, but at the same time they're upset about the people on the streets being bussed up by Governor Abbott, for example, and that whole phenomenon. And then immigrants being sent to motels and other places in the Hudson Valley. And it was creating a lot of discomfort for people who were sort of pro-immigration, but then they're seeing all this chaos. And I think the film kind of grounded them. We saw in the dialogue that happened after the film, where it just reminded them, wait a minute, hold, these are human beings, and we have to find a way to, make this work and bring some order to this thing. Because like my friend in Norway that I just mentioned over there, they're finding ways to bring people in, channel them in. And Governor Abbott's doing exactly the opposite, just sort of bussing people up. And I have to say, he's been effective that way, right? I mean, it's a nasty thing to do, and they're doing it. That it's so we hope that Pamela and I are going to go on a tour around the country with the film. We're going to be at screenings all over the country, and like I said earlier, people can also host their own screenings. We just want people to talk about this and see the humanity of what's behind immigration.
And the most effective screening is always when protagonists of the film are either there in person or can come in via Zoom on the big screen after the movie. And we'd love to have you do that as well, Fernando.
Thank you.
Yes.
I wanted to say that actually we need to make a distinction between ideologues that we will never agree with. The ones that are proposing the replacement theory, the invasion, I mean, those ones that actually by nature are assuming a white supremacist, racist, anti-immigrant narrative. I think we don't have any interest on convincing them or having a dialogue with them. But I think people is listening to them without all of the facts. And I think that's where we need to come. Because what would happen if somebody knows that billions of dollars of their taxpayer monies are being spent to actually persecute children, incarcerate children, and harm people? So what would people say? That part of American soil is being militarized right now at the border, as never before. And if you don't do something, then this is going to come to haunt you. What that means is, if we're allowing this to happen at the border, then maybe already happening in the interior. So because many of the bad things in terms of enforcement happen at the border, and then we start happening in police departments in the interior. So, I mean, we see an increased militarization of police departments in a very similar way what been happening for years at the border. So what then is going to happen when the border becomes the nation, right? I mean, something that was so far away from you, like border walls and the military at the border, and you say that you didn't care, even you justify it until you see it in your neighborhood or in your community. So I think it is a warning in anything, if anything, or it's a prediction that if we don't do something about stopping this craziness at the border, this not only in terms of spending all of that money, but also causing so much harm and justifying it, it's going to come to haunt everybody in America later.
True. That's why the full title of Borderland is Borderland, not lands. It's Borderland, the line within, because every immigrant carries the border within themselves, wherever they may be in the country. So the border is literally everywhere. And following on what Fernando just said about militarization, we already saw that happen in Portland back in 2020. We saw it happen in Washington, D.C., where they bring up the Border Patrol to do actions that they're not really intended to do, right? So already it's just sort of using military, and the Border Patrol responds to the executive, right? It has no accountability, really. in Congress. You know, it's sort of like a police force for the executive.
Yeah, and it gets used in a lot of contexts. I mean, I'll make space for one more question, but I should just address the question more toward WOLA and how are we reaching the Harris campaign? Well, I mean, you know, we actually try to reach both campaigns, but following sort of on what Fernando was saying, I mean, the ideologues, you really just don't want to give them, you don't want to give them a lot of time or raise their profile. You're not going to spend, if you tried to spend all day like fact checking a Donald Trump speech, that would not be the best use of your day. You want to strengthen the people and give the arguments and give the information to the people who are maybe already more inclined to work on a better border agenda. You want to make sure you know, you can strengthen them and get that base fired up. You also want people maybe who are in the center, and here I may be referring to one of the campaigns, who would rather have the issue not interfere as much and have it go away and maybe just deal with it some other time, but you want them to actually embrace some reforms, and you want them to be bolder. You don't do that by, you know, if they support a certain policy, you don't do that by calling it draconian or monstrous or something like that, but you absolutely do fact check them when they say something that they should know better. You do call them on it, and you do try as best you can to sell better alternatives to those more centrist and more persuadable people. And make sure that you've laid the foundation for them if they are elected to pursue a better path. I know that was a little vague, but you know, we're in the middle of an election season. That leads to the question, this final question here, which sort of goes on the discussion we were just having about use of border patrol, use of the border almost as an experiment for policing, federal policing elsewhere in the country, like a workshop to try out new tactics. And this question is, you know, there's a lot of parallels between sort of border and immigration reform and police reform or incarceration reform in general. And, you know, there was a moment in 2020 around, you know, the George Floyd protests and all the protests against what the Trump administration was doing at the border and using the Border Patrol in Portland, where there did seem to be some overlap between the internal police reform movement and the immigration reform movement. My impression, though, is, you know, while there is push for reform and accountability, they have not been coordinating very closely together, especially during the Biden years. But I'd like to hear others' responses to that question about those two movements, if any.
Well, if I think what is more clear now for us, working within border communities and immigrants and Latinos, is that what we are going through. I mean, that means the criminalization of our communities, militarization of our communities, is not happening to us only at the border. That is happening to other communities, like the Black communities, especially criminalization of young Black people, or the criminalization of women, right, of other minorities. So what we are seeing is an expansion of the use of criminalization of minorities in ways that we hadn't seen it before, and that is leading to more unaccountable enforcement, less objective, and more kind of brutal, irrational enforcement all of our communities. So I don't see a difference between the actions of a Border Patrol agent that gets up that morning and goes and then shot and kill a 15-year-old Mexican at the border than what happened maybe in Compton or Chicago, where the same thing happened with the police officer at that moment, right? They do exactly the same, the use of brutal force against communities of color. So I don't see a difference. There's no difference in terms of what we need to be asking for. That yes, it's about accountability and oversight and community policing and all of these things, but also it's about decreasing militarization and eliminating criminalization of communities. So I think, but we had not yet found the mechanism or the mechanisms to connect our communities yet. I mean, we're eager to. I mean, there's this is multi-racial coalition that should come together. I mean, we talk about criminal justice reform, but criminal justice reform usually don't include Latinos. We talk about border accountability and border enforcement reform, and that doesn't include Black communities. So I think we still a way to go in terms of bringing first the communities together and then the platforms together to actually create a larger change.
Well, thank you, Fernando. I see that we are past 5 o'clock on the East Coast now, so maybe I'll just finish with a question to the creators of Borderland, Pamela and Paco. Do you have plans to keep pursuing border and migration stories in your next projects?
Well, we don't make that many films, so every film that we do make, we need to create a multi-year outreach and impact campaign with it. So right now we are planning, we have in place a national tour that we're working really hard between now and the elections in November to put out this counter narrative, to talk about immigration in a different way, to involve people, to urge them to vote, to urge them to be active, to urge them to make sure that their votes are for candidates who create the space in which we can work for a reform, a humane immigration policies, and where immigrants and immigrant families and immigrant communities have what they need to operate. And envision a new kind of country that could welcome immigrants and spend these billions of dollars on welcoming them. So we're totally in that. We're going to be in El Paso on September 28th at the El Paso Film Festival. But we're going to be all over the country. And we also have on our website, which is skylight.is, Skylight is, a way for all organizations across the country to access the film for their membership and to have these kinds of screenings and these kinds of discussions. It's really been a pleasure to be able to talk with all of you who I can see, all of you who I can't see, but who I know are there.
Yeah, and I would just add that, really we're a human rights organization. We're a nonprofit human rights organization like yourselves, like Border Network, like WOLA, and our human rights practices through film, whereas a legal organization does it through legal actions, and Border Network does it through organizing and documentation, right? And WOLA does it with documentation. So that's why we're going to be with this film for a long time. We don't have another film in the works right now because there's so much work left to do with this film. So that's really where we're going to be for the next many months and years, actually.
That's important that the audience know that when you do one of these projects, you stick with it for a while, and it's not just it's out in the world, and we hope that people like it. You're really moving it. So you can find information about the tour and about the film and other efforts to get it out and how you can do a screening at skylight.is. You can learn a lot about the work of the Border Network for Human Rights at bnhr.org. Do any of you have any other resources you want to point people to, or did I just get everything? All right, don't forget wola.org while you're at it. Pamela Yates, Paco de Onís, Fernando Garcia, and Maureen Meyer, thank you so much for joining us. This was a really great discussion, and congratulations again on the film and your role in it, and both of these reflections on how to tell this story and push for change and more effectively. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank all of you for your questions.